at it. This gonna be part 2, Origins of Civilization. This interpretation is pretty cool. Some pretty good translations here that are coming through. Some pretty good vibes from this guy right here, Bourbourg. Apparently this is the guy that's responsible. I don't know. Is it him? I guess it's him. This is who they say it is. Bourbourg. So we're gonna keep reading. But first, before getting into the reading aspect, I did want to show y'all this. This was pretty cool. As I was searching up his name, as you see right here, he's got a lot of things that were sold that were clearly originals or close to it. And I don't know if it was estimated at this clearly, but it looked like it passed. So there's some lot details. Talks all about it right here if you want to pause and read through this. Pretty important stuff here that we're talking about. You can clearly see. So I think I can zoom into this stuff, which is pretty cool. And you can see this is on his Palenque book. It's clearly close to an original. Showing some monuments here. Look at these structures. Beautiful. Thought this was really pretty. Look at the ornamentation just on the walls alone. Again, the ornamentation. Look at that, y'all. Look at that, y'all. These ones are really pretty. The artistic renderings here are just amazing. And as we go through the book, we're going to get a better understanding of a lot of these things as well. What's going on, the meaning of these. What's he got going on? He's got a bull with a tongue coming out on top of his head. So detailed. There goes the X and the cross up here. What does he got in his hand? Is that a sword? What's going down? I've seen this one. This is a sword, matter of fact. And he's actually stabbing the hand. Just posted this recently. Not as of good a version, but it's pretty fascinating too. Just imagine. Take a moment to set yourself in this zone. Covered in waters. For how long? Cultivated lands. Beautiful workmanship here in relation to the art. Look at that. Isn't that fabulous? Look. Look at that, y'all. What are they offering? And why are they offering? These symbols each mean something. Each one of these. It's got a deep meaning. Look at the clothes, look at the hair, look at the rope, the tassels. Everything is so deep and significant. Just them stepping on him as he's completely bared down and him with his hands. That's symbolic. Everything is so symbolic. Look at this Phrygian cap. Look at that cap, y'all. What is going on here? Y'all see, they don't want to talk about this. This is what's amazing. Look at the Persian type lines. That's number one. Look at the Asian type way in which they're decoded, put forth. Similarities of Asian style. You already know. But then what's amazing too is look at the Phrygian cap. Just fabulous, man. It almost makes you think Greek, you know? So many similarities. But we already know what's up. Then you got even the jade. And these jades always get thrown into like Asian aspects. Like it was brought here, but could it possibly have been brought there? Seems so. Man, would I love to have that knife. That is amazing. Look at that. Oh my gosh. That is amazing, man. Whoever has that in real life, oh my gosh, that's gotta be such a piece, bro. Whoever had that was a king, man. That thing is amazing. Look at this. Into the dragon's mouth. Look at the horns. What? Come on, y'all. I've never seen these. I looked through a couple and was like, I'm gonna wait to look through the rest with them. Get excited. This is really cool though. Look at that. Just think about walking into that. With some fires lit. Oh my gosh, at night. Oh. Yeah. I think that's the end of it. So yeah. Just beautiful though, right? Yucatan, baby. So apparently this was a book that they sold. And I'm gonna have to check it out, make sure they got it on the archive. So we'll take this one down, or move it out, should I say, the frame at this point. So remember, we are in the 4 letters. What are we in? Let's see. Let's get this bad boy translated real quick. So y'all remember, this is what we're in. We're in the 4 letters on Mexico, an absolute exposition of the Mexican hieroglyphic system, the end of the Stone Age, temporary Ice Age, beginning of the Bronze Age, origins of civilization, and the religions of antiquity, according to the Tlatoani and the other Mexican documents. Okay, so this is part 2. Remember, we're taking it from French and translating it over here from ChatGPT. Okay, the Google translation just doesn't work as well. So we're getting into it. Like I said, we started off on page 39 up here on section 7. So we're gonna keep it going. So it is from these all-powerful Toltecs that the founders of primitive societies took their name. The Chichimecs, the Aztecs, are also symbolic names, borrowed from the forces of nature or from the condition of those who originally took on these names, and which the tribes of the Valley of Mexico later adorned themselves with. These names may have either served to hierarchy, distinguished the castes of the same society, much like the names of the castes in India, or they may have been intended to specifically recall the regions designated by one or another of the phenomena of which these tribes were the living symbols. However, the first hypothesis seems to me the most in line with the general sentiment of Mexican history. The 7 Nahuatl tribes would have initially been different castes, established according to the number of 7 Toltec chiefs and the 7 primitive volcanoes. Unlike the more rigid castes in India, these would have vied for power at different times. If the destruction of the Toltecs is historically accurate, it could only apply to a major social revolution where the priestly class, weaker than the Brahmins in India, would have succumbed in a formidable struggle and dispersed to the 4 winds of the nations. The complete translation and interpretation of the Tlatoani may later allow me to elaborate on this subject and to point out the results of such a revolution in the astonishing dispersion of rites and symbols originating from a unique cradle throughout the entire world. It is a subject of serious and vast contemplation. You will no doubt ask me now how I arrived in such a short time at conclusions so different from everything my mind had previously conceived. I will answer. It is the dual interpretation of the text of the Codex Champopacua or Champopaca that has opened up to me the mysterious treasures of the past. It is this wondrous interpretation that has informed me of the true meaning of all these names of the kings and tribes, that has made me understand the important role that the geological myth played in the accounts of antiquity. It is by learning to read this dual meaning of the Nahuatl text that I recognize that these tribal names were all derived from the attributes of volcanic power that disrupted the world. 6,000 or 7,000 years ago was either shaken by these symbols connected to this catastrophe. What all my documents recount is the story of these upheavals, the history of the cataclysm, of which all peoples have preserved the memory. I must confess, I never expected this outcome from my studies, although it seems I had foreseen it more than once recently, especially at the time when I published with my translation of Landa, my dissertation on Egyptian and Mexican monuments. Still walking uncertainly through the labyrinth of American traditions, I was citing various fragments of ancient cosmogonies related to this cataclysm without fully understanding them. I believed I could confidently say that the time would come when we would rediscover some of the precious documents mentioned in the chronicles of the conquest, little suspecting that I already had them in my library. America, I said at the time, has so far been the subject of no serious archaeological investigation. A few individual works cannot compare with the multitude of those that have taken place for Egypt or Asia, where European governments have generously contributed to the expenses. However, perhaps it is America that will contribute more to the solution of the great historical problems, the key to which has been vainly sought until now. This solution we will find in the cartons or cartouches inlaid in its monuments, in the books buried in tombs since the conquest, and maybe even in those already in our libraries. We will eventually read the Codex of Dresden, and we hope to interpret the Tonalamat or Mexican ritual in the library of the Legislative Corps, of which Mr. Aubin also owns an original copy. It is in these mysterious books that we will discover, alongside the system of Mexican judicial astrology and the errors of the ecclesiastical ritual, the oldest historical documents, all the origins of the mystical ceremonies of a cult that had perpetuated itself through the revolutions of nations and cities, preserving in the most perfect chronological order the account of antediluvian memories and natural catastrophes that had, on various occasions, shaken the world since God placed humanity in it. These memorable facts form the basis of the entire Mexican religion. It is the tradition of these facts that was daily repeated in the stories of the gods and ancient heroes, whose name alone seemed to have undergone changes over the centuries. We find them in the sacred ballets, in the fasts and penances imposed in turn by priests, princes, and the nation. Finally, in all rites, in each of the important festivals of the ritual, under different names but which ultimately had the same meaning or were represented by symbols identical to those of Mexico. It was still the traditions of these extraordinary events that the uses and ceremonies of the cult recalled, not only among the other civilized nations of Mexico and Central America, but also amongst most of the populations of South America as well. Continuing, this American race had been so strongly constituted by its first legislators. It was so conservative in its customs and traditions. Nevertheless, America did not lack innovators. Just like the old world, it is clear that new doctrines sought to supplant the old ones in various parts of the continent and at different times. However, it does not appear that these innovations ever succeeded in prevailing to the point of making the others forgotten. On the contrary, all the evidence we have gathered so far suggests that they only managed to take root by either preserving the previous symbols or identifying with them. This inclines us to believe that to find the oldest history of the entire world, we should compare the ancient traditions of Asia and Egypt with those of the indigenous peoples of America. Very powerful. While waiting for the interpretation of the books we cite above, which contain these traditions in full, we must turn to various cosmogonic fragments preserved in books and stories from the time of the conquest. The most formal are those we call the History of the Suns, cited by Humboldt from Gamara, and found with variations in various documents, particularly in the Codex Chimalpopoca. As we have already noted, these suns are indicated as epochs during which various world catastrophes occurred. We have also noted that the number of catastrophes indicated by these suns varies in most of the cited documents, as does the order in which they occurred. We will not examine here what led to the confusion of these events. It seems to us that this disorder belongs to a time after the Spanish conquest. This could be explained by the desire of the indigenous people who were responsible for explaining them and had to please their new masters to adapt the American flood to the flood of Mosaic traditions. Whatever the case may be, it would appear according to the annotations of the Codex Letelier that there were particularly three memorable epochs where humanity, after having existed for centuries, was suddenly torn from its ordinary occupations and largely annihilated due to natural convulsions. The earth, shaken by terrible earthquakes, flooded by both the sea's waves and volcanic fire, stirred in its bowels by internal gases seeking an outlet to its surface, and agitated by formidable hurricanes. This is the picture that American traditions present of this continent at three distant epochs. These are chronologically determined in books that ignorance has made disappear at the time of the conquest, but may, perhaps, be found again someday. It was just 4 years ago that I wrote these lines. Could I have imagined then that so shortly afterward I would find myself in possession of the instrument destined to break the seals of these mysterious books in his hands? This is, however, where the interpretation of the Codex Chimalpopoca led me. It is in these extraordinary pages that I read now, following the eruption of volcanoes that opened across the entire extent of the American continent, then twice what it is today. A sudden eruption of an immense underwater focus shattered the world and destroyed, between one dawn and another of the morning star, the richest regions of the world. This is not a novel that I am recounting here, as some have said about Plato's tale of Atlantis. I am merely summarizing the facts narrated in the Tiahuanacochtli and all the accounts of Itztliutzotl and others, whose paintings can be seen among the documents in the Kingsborough collection. There, you will see, sir, an image of a tree covered with flowers, its trunk broken in the middle, and from which, according to authors, flows of blood escape. This tree, I must admit, after being a dark enigma for me for a long time, has become one of the most significant causes of enlightenment in my mind. How many times I had consulted my authors in the hope of gaining clarity, and always in vain. According to the Vatican copy and the Letelier manuscript, this tree, known as Tamaonchan, symbolized a kind of earthly paradise from which the gods were cast into hell for daring to lay sacrilegious hands on it and strip it of its fruits and flowers. This also explains the name Xochicalcacan, the upright flower. For Xochitl, the flower, considered the Mexican Venus and the goddess of lust, was, according to commemorators like Rios, Frabeget, and many others, a confused memory of the biblical Eve having been the first to touch these fruits recklessly. Others gave this tree the name of Qualilicacan, the upright tree, Esquawil, the blood tree, due to the blood that appeared to gush from it. Mr. Abin even told me one day that he believed he saw an allusion to the Christian idea of the tree of the cross, suggesting a primitive Christianity in America. I must confess, sir, I was not inclined to accept these various versions. Nevertheless, as you have seen above, enlightenment did not come all at once. The translation of the part of the Codex Chimalpopoca, which I titled The History of the Suns, coupled with an examination of the Codex Borgia plates, first led me to seek in this blood-stained tree the effects of the rising sun. I discovered under various symbols the battles of the dawn with clouds, and the name Xochitl, assimilated to dawn in the Vatican copy's comments, further confirmed me in this view. These battles between the sun and the clouds, light and darkness, are also one of the many veils shrouding this story. I was gradually approaching the truth, open if you will, the third volume of Kingsborough's folios 18 and 20 of the Codex Borgia. What do you see? This marvelous tree, discussed in all traditions, broken in the middle of the trunk, from which torrents of fire erupt. At first, I took this rupture to be a gorge between two fields of earth, from which the morning star burst forth brilliantly. But when the blindfold fell from my eyes, it was neither the rising of the sun nor dawn that I discovered, but a volcano, its gaping mouth vomiting the fires from its bowels. The tree was indeed the earth, but this earth was the American continent, torn apart by subterranean power. The chunk that separated from it was the vast portion of the continent that once covered the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, extending far towards Europe and Africa, to the east and northeast. Yes, the blood that one thought they saw is the boiling blood of the earth as it spills open. It is the lava that flows everywhere. The tree's flowers are the volcanoes that burst forth like buds on a bouquet. And the tree, you recognize it, is the one found in all ancient mythologies, Egyptian, Persian, Hindu. It is the Vehuehuetel of Mexican legends, the mystical cypress, about which Mr. Lagar recently wrote a remarkable dissertation, and all the texts agree perfectly well with the interpretation of the Mexican text. Continuing on, this letter serves merely as an introduction, and I will elaborate on these matters at the appropriate time. However, in the meantime, I ask you to note that there is a remarkable connection between this tree and the sacred home of Persia, the of Egypt, the Odu of Mexico, and the Hum of Central America. I will explain the meaning of this mysterious word, which is used in mythologies to denote things that seem quite different on the surface but are fundamentally identical at the right time and place. I will also show you its existence even today in many of the so-called Indo-European languages. These facts, sir, are supported by all Mexican documents and the translation of the Codex Chimalpopoca will offer you the most complete proof of them. The history recorded there is that of the most horrifying catastrophe of which humans have retained memory. All its episodes, down to the smallest details, have been preserved not only in American religions, but in all those of our continent. Do not be surprised by the confidence with which I speak to you at this moment. It arises neither from pride nor from boundless self-assurance. It is the fruit of a profound conviction based not on imaginary results but on the most clear-cut and distinct facts. Why then, when the truth is bursting forth from all sides, when the thickest veils are being torn one after another, should I not proclaim it fully? Why should I stammer like a child, wrap myself in false modesty, when I am given the opportunity to speak openly? No, sir, without fear of the sarcasm that the revelation of so many new things may initially provoke. I will speak it loudly, confident in the wisdom of true scholars who alone are capable of listening and judging without arrogance or bias. Sincerely, etc. So that's an end to this section here. Pretty extreme. Pretty extreme. So that was the end, I believe, of the first letter. And we're just gonna push on into this second letter. Maybe I should have ended the first part there, but this is a good way to start off a new episode. I'd say so. Continuing on in the second letter, section 1. You have read my first letter on Mexico, and you admit that it has interested you. However, I see that you are not entirely satisfied. According to your perspective, I am too concise, touch upon too many topics at once, and do not sufficiently elaborate on any. I proceed with a freedom that you would readily label as presumption, and despite my protest, you find arrogance in my confidence. By your account, my entire letter is but a series of enigmas, certainly enough to pique the curiosity of scholars, but leaving you and many other readers suspended between indecision and absolute incredulity. I understand your complaints, but are they well-founded? Please remember that this first letter was merely a prelude to those that are to follow. I have discussed many topics, that's true, but I have hardly touched upon all the subjects I intend to cover. How could I possibly fit the details of numerous topics into just 25 pages? Admit there is more that is needed. I've succeeded in arousing your curiosity. That is all I aimed for at this moment. It is usually so challenging to engage the Parisian mind with American archaeology. Your limited faith in ancient America is so arbitrary that to please you, one would have to construct a distinctly Gaelic America, akin to certain so-called historical novels. But now, I too am complaining. Let's tackle our subject head on and return to Mexico. You wish for me to cease presenting enigmas, very well, but don't get impatient. Remember that I have to discuss all of the ancient paganism with you, and I need as much space as time to lay out all my evidence before you. You are familiar with the passage from Homer that attributes a system of gods, and consequently, as one of your old friends to whom I will borrow more than one thought adds, a system of worlds, to Okeanos and Tethys. There is absolutely nothing Homeric in this, he continues, for it recalls neither the antecedents of the Homeric system, nor any relation to its gods, the gods of Olympus, and their origin. This entire theory is ancient. It comes from the schools of theology in an old Asia, originally Sapphian or Cushitic, an Asia that takes its cue from the Ethiopians on the east, as Homer calls them, an Asia that was the source of inspiration for the Aryas, right in their cradle, before the great separation of the peoples, given the name of Indo-European peoples, a name that is, parenthetically, most unfortunate. The Baron de Eckstein, whose words I cite here, is among the few scholars who have most deeply penetrated the primitive idea of ancient cults. However, instead of looking at an old Chamitic Asia for the origins he sought, he had faithfully followed the indications of Homer, whom he invokes for this matter. He would have directed his attention not to the east but to the west. Do not interrupt me, I beg you, until you have heard me out completely, and do not cry out if I make use of Homer and Baron de Eckstein in relation to Mexico. If I take you to America instead of leading you to Asia, it is the logic of the facts, even the logic of your own Homer, that guides me. Note that well. But the Danish scholar, supposing he had been tempted to look for the explanation of the enigmas he had before him in that direction, would have been unable to conclude anything for lack of authentic and precise documents. Like so many other scholars, he had only most elementary notions about America. So this task falls to me. Therefore, I beseech you, my dear sir, to abandon your prejudices, those classical prejudices so deeply rooted in you. And if I speak of America in relation to Asia or Africa, do not think me the playing thing of my imagination. Just do not let yourself be carried away by the systematic disorder of your own. So be patient, shed the old man completely, and let me explain myself thoroughly. Let us then pick up the traces of Homer, and if you find his geography so exact for the East, have enough confidence in him to believe that he is no less accurate concerning the West. Let us go back with Homer and Hesiod to the ancient traditions of the Ethiopians of the East and the West, true remnants, as your friend de Eckstein also rightly says, of a primitive world map, a map that you will help me reconstruct at a given time. From a lake flushed with the fires of the setting sun emerges Homer's Helios to ascend to the east and thrown again in a sky of bronze. Eos, Volker have connected this passage to a fragment of Aeschylus, Prometheus Unbound, where the choir of Titans comes to find Prometheus tied to Mount Caucasus. They arrive from the lake that is burning red, or a gulf of the setting sun on the banks of Okeanos, the river that encircles the globe. There, Helios descends with his weary steeds after their day's journey in the land of the western Ethiopians. He refreshes himself and by his bath rejuvenates the entire world in its divinity. These Ethiopians, according to the Odyssey, are divided into two groups, called the men of the two ends of extremities of the world. The great gods gather there at certain times of the year, once among the Ethiopians of the east, another time among the Ethiopians of the west. It is among the latter that Zeus spends the famous 12 nights at the end of the year that we encounter in ancient mythologies, and which belong to the structure of an old calendar. Up to this point, your friend is correct. But does this thought not wonder when he wants to look for the region inhabited by the Ethiopians of the West in Abyssinia, the land of Meroe, or the vicinity of Arabia, while placing those of the East at the sources of the great rivers that water India? How could these Ethiopians be the men of both ends of the world? surely if Homer is accurate, and no educated Hellenist doubts his accuracy, the Ethiopians of the East could only be the brown and coppery races of the Asian continent and its vicinity, and the Ethiopians of the West, the brown and coppery races of America, since Homer's West is this very setting from which his Helios emerges, that is to say, the ocean. So, please be logical, sir, and do not look for the West and the South, for that would be like looking for noon at 2 o'clock, according to the old Gaelic saying. Despite the lies of the Greeks, despite their often proven ignorance, if those who only want to or can read the works of the Greeks had nevertheless followed their indications without bias, they would have discovered an America like Christopher Columbus. The ocean can only be the ocean, and this ocean is always the Atlantic Ocean unless it is explicitly about the one that encircles the world. It is the one whose root is ok or og, to moan, enter, embark, dominate, according to the various meanings given by the Quiche language, meaning that are all. The more true, here's they all relate to the great geological events from which the ocean emerged. For there was buried amid the moans this god, whose death all idolatrous nations once mourned on November the 13th. It is there that this god took his path to enter into the eternal dwelling. It is finally there that the gods of Egypt embarked on the Nile, mourning Osiris, descended to the underworld of which he constituted himself the master and sovereign. Hence, all these mythological ideas about the ocean, hence the name of Ogun, which precisely means in Quiche the moaning, the entry, the embarkation, the hidden mysterious domination. Just as in the Maya language, Ogun means the descended leg. This leg being, as you will see later, the hieroglyphic character of Osiris in America, of Osiris swept away in the flood of Ojijis, whose name is, in turn, in Quiche, the explanation of the same event. Oh, I hope y'all are loving this. I hope you're really enjoying this, y'all. And as I'm reading this, I hope y'all really enjoying this. But as I'm reading this, feel free to look and search up some of these key terms. You see the words, you can see them, search them up. See what pictures you can find. Really get you an understanding of what's going on, you know. So here we go on into section 2. Who then is Osiris, in your opinion, you might ask? Well, Osiris is the earth buried under the waves of the Atlantic. Listen carefully, for I am about to give you the most sacred key word of ancient mysteries, the most august password to penetrate the sanctuary whose veil has thickened since the centuries of the pharaohs. To the world, Osiris represents the half of the American continent that volcanic eruptions sank into the abyss in a single day and a fateful night. As Plato states about Atlantis, between one rising and another of the morning star, according to the Codex Chimalpopoca, this is why Osiris is the king of Orcus, the supreme judge of the eternal and infernal regions, like Mictlan Teuctli, the lord of the Mexican hell. Now, if you want to know what this western gulf is, this fiery limne on the banks of Okeanos, please open volume 3 of Lord Kingsborough's collection with me, and on plate 76 of the Codex Borgia you will see this limne. It is the immense furnace that appeared after Osiris raising his phallus, i.e. the immense mountain of the long-submerged volcano existing in the Caribbean Sea. Let it sink into this terrifying blaze. That is the limne. That is the swamp, signified by the blue color surrounding it. It's the famous Tolan of the Mexicans. It's the Jonquière, a low and fertile region that once covered the two largest gulfs of America, the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. Such is also the true meaning of Soma in the religion of the Vedas. Literally, the piercing, the opening of the arm, ko, ma. In the Mexican language, the sunken earth having been alternately compared to an arm, a leg, and even a phallus. As for the cup of Soma, identical to that of Dionysus, a name in which you find the same root ko, to pierce open this cup of libations that occurs in the great atmospheric vat, filled with the juices of effluence of the earth, the skies, and the ocean. You already recognize it yourself in the vast volcanic tear in this furnace, in this titanic cup, where all effluence, the telluric powers, are agitated in the intoxication of destruction and ruin. It is known that Surya, like Helios, embarks in this cup with his chariot and horses. It serves him as a ship in crossing the two ends of the world. Stesicor sings this De Pascracian, this golden cup. Helios embarks for the crossing of the ocean to reach the sacred abysses of the dark night, where he will join the mother of his children and his children themselves in the midst of fresh groves. These sacred abysses of the dark night, you recognize them with me, and those of the ocean, dug to receive the great mummy, which all idolatrous religions made their god. Hence the idea of Orcus, of hell, that presides over the origin of these religions. You find in this underwater volcano Ahirbudnya, the fire dragon at the heart of the volcano, from the Rig Veda. He is the god who reigns in the three worlds. He is the son of Tavashtar, who engenders himself. He is the master of the heavenly earth, the atmospheric hearth, and the hearth of the abyss that gave him birth. He is the fiery dragon found in the legends of almost all peoples, the genie of the underground hearth, who, upon his appearance, will overthrow half of the world. To him belongs this cult of the underground altar, of the cave altar, which your friend Mr. Diekstein rightly claims for the Hamitic races. These races, once again, are indeed the Ethiopians of the two ends of the world, those of Asia and East Africa, and those of America. It is to these races that one must go back, and he so rightly deduces, to find the origin of this cult. And as we come into this next translation here, if you don't know anything about the Ethiopians, shout out Caramel, what's up my boy, I know you watching. Yeah, y'all check out the East and West Ethiopians, learn more about them from Caramel, and yeah, you can figure out what's going on here. But this is tying directly into it, its correlation, and it's giving a pretty good example for everybody to clearly understand what's going on. So, but still check out those videos in the meantime. So we'll continue. A Hamitic breath is felt, he says, in this dust of Babylonian, Tyrian, and Sidonian cosmogonies, of which we possess more than one curious relic. It seems to stir up whirlwinds. The figure of the same thought is variously engraved and reproduced on the monuments of ancient Egypt. I am not talking about identities here. There is nothing like that. I am talking about a family resemblance that one perceives in a certain kinship of ideas. Unquote. Well, this family resemblance can also be found among American cosmogonies, among the mythological traditions of transoceanic Western nations. But if you compare American ideas with a large part of those of the Old World, you will discover not only a family resemblance, but also a real kinship and often complete conformity in myths and symbols. To better elucidate the essence of this thought in this regard, Baron Diekstein examines one by one all the monuments of the Old World. He talks about the stelae or keones, these columns placed at the entrances of Phoenician temples, in which Hiram had used to decorate the entrance of the sanctuary built by Solomon at Mount Moriah. I will explain later the meaning of these columns, which, as he also says, are themselves a hieroglyph. I will go back with you to the primitive meaning of this hieroglyph, which your friend saw only in its outer layer without understanding it. We will see it first in its unity, then in the dualism of the two columns, and we will trace back to its source, the divine character placed between the two, while finding a way to reconcile the various opinions that have been debated on this mysterious subject for about 3,000 years. The documents of Hamitic races, he then says, are few in number, and only Egypt can open the field of discoveries for us. Indeed, Egypt seemed destined to provide, along with the key to its hieroglyphs, the mysterious meaning of ancient symbols, but unknowingly, it only paved the way, being a daughter of America as well as India. It had to leave the honor of breaking the first silence to its mothers, a silence that both had maintained for so many centuries. If Egyptologists, instead of following the Greeks in their assessments of high antiquity, had set aside the philosophical transcendentalism of the Alexandrian school, if they had, like my friend, Mr. Rilu, a diligent listener to Mr. Darouge, properly valued in their translations of the Book of the Dead the Egyptian words for which they have already compiled such complete dictionaries, Egypt would certainly have had priority. It would have been the first to reveal the world's curiosity, the astonishing history that I intend to disclose with the Codex Chamapapaca. Continuing on, it will nevertheless appear with increasing certainty, and here I fully agree with D. Eckstein, that the Hamitic race has led in civilization over the rest of humanity. It has, so to speak, he adds, provided the framework in which the Semites first and the Aryans later could house their thoughts before filling it with the originality of their spirit. For, he continues, they received from Ham only the forms, which is, however, quite significant. But as for the spirit, they owe him absolutely nothing. If I highlight these words, where I find, moreover, such deep meaning, it is because I must declare here that the last thought they contain is either an error, or what is called the Aryan race must have received from that of Ham, in addition to forms, the spirit that animates them in the entirety of religion. For long before the separation of the races that might have found themselves facing each other at the origin, not only had all forms of worship received their completion, but they already enclosed under their hieroglyphs more than the seeds of poetic traditions, religious mysticism, and sacred genealogies that later existed among all peoples of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Otherwise, how would it be that these concepts are found identically in the traditions and writings of the Americans, often even expressed by words that are equally identical in meaning and sound? This, sir, is what I will have occasion to establish, without the friends of Mr. Good, Mr. Bop, having anything to reproach me for. Now, as for Mr. D. Eckstein, he notes, through very remarkable insights, the distinctive character of each of the three main races of the prehistoric ancient world. Lacking positive documents among the Hamites, he seeks to recover at least in part the secret of the science of Ham and the forms of worship among the Semites and Aryans. The relations between the Semites and the Hamites, he says, are entirely evident. It is Ham who lives alongside Shem in the books of the Old Testament. The Vedas are Aryan by the power of the unique breath. It is Aryan, as the Old Testament is Semitic. But the antecedents of worship, the arrangement of the altar, the orientation of space, the division of the cosmic year, everything that touches on the forms of religion, apart from its content, but a certain core of ideas that hides under a hierarchically arranged technical terminology, the concept of the divine value of the forms of worship, the notation of sounds, accents, intonations, the reduction of the sacred importance of language to these sounds, these accents, these intonations, the abstraction made of the true meaning of the words, of their sentiment, of their etymology, of the mythic genius of the speak of the Aryans, the exclusive divinization of rhythms, considered at the highest expression of the body of speech in a word. Everything that thus hides behind reality in relation to the primitive concept of the archai, and the stoichia is all this Aryan. And again, the recurrence of certain figures, which are only hieroglyphs and can only be explained by the antecedents of the sacred hieroglyphics, is this Aryan? So, section 3. Your scholarly friend who poses these questions believes he solves them by saying, the Vedas answer all these questions. It attributes all this to the Gandharvas, who were the instructors and masters. We will soon say that it considers the Marutas, the ancestors of the Aryans, as barbarians who wandered in the woods, ignorant of the sacra, of the gods, of the altar, the symbols of the Agnes and Soma. It tells us how the Skara, or Sakra, were communicated to these hunters of the wild life, then withdrawn, how they ended up stealing the gods that had been stolen from them, how they seized them by force, how the reign of Tvactor ended, how the reign of Varuna was substituted for it, etc. Therefore, it is enough to question the Veda, well, for it to answer. It makes us touch a state of things that precedes the Aryans and makes us know their ancient masters. I admire the depth of Mr. D. Eckstein's views, but with all respect that I have for this ingenious criticism, I will allow myself to say my opinion in turn. Yes, the Veda, questioned from this point of view, answers your questions, but is its answer not still an enigma? If it makes you touch a state of things prior to the Aryans, does it not in any way make you know who their predecessors are, nor where they acquired the science that they let be taken away with the Sakra? Each of the verses of the Veda is still a myth, whose meaning you only vaguely grasp. Each of the words that make up these verses encloses a hieroglyph, the key to which the masters of the sacred language of India have kept for themselves. If they have not lost it, well, sir, it is this key that I have discovered the mysterious deposit of, and which is now a matter of communicating to the scholarly world. The same key also opens the door to the Hindu sanctuaries, as well as the sacred books of Persia and Egypt, as well as the mysteries of Eleusis and Samothrace. For all these things are one, in a great variety of forms and symbols. The veil that covered them has been torn, and I have seen everything in its entirety. Every day reveals new details to me. Much less knowledgeable about the language and books of India than your friend D. Eckstein was, a humble disciple who arrived at the last hour in the field of Oriental science. A single glance was enough for me to understand what his penetration could not discover: the hidden meaning of myths in their sacred envelope. Do not be surprised, moreover, to see me so often quote the words of the noble Dane. In my eyes, Baron D. Eckstein is the one, of all the scholars I know, who has come closest to this ancient deposit, and I find in him a scientific terminology that I was little accustomed to before, but which serves me admirably to express my thoughts today. The pivot of Vedic worship, he adds, a little further down, is the adoration of the gods associated with the altar, the two columns of the altar, the two stelae of the altar, as it were the Sihala Divata. It is absolutely the same for the gods Hephaestus and Dionysus among the Pelasgians, as for the god Volcanus and the god Jupiter Liber among the old stock Latins. These are the gods of the altar. They are the true foundations, the columns, the stelae of the domestic hearth. This hearth is the principle of the altar itself. It goes from the family to the gens, or to the phratry, then from this to the association of neighbors, to the Amphictyoni, and it ends or terminates in the constitution of a polis, a state, a city, the center of a nation, of a people. I read these lines several times before arriving at the point where I am today, before possessing the key that allows me to appreciate their accuracy and depth. I admired them instinctively, without understanding their true meaning, but at this moment I quote them as a tribute of homage, all the more complete to the memory of the scholar who wrote them, as they apply in the most formal way to the subject matter at hand. This hearth, this association, this city, you discover them in the Egyptian, Mexican, or Maya hieroglyph, which I mention in my first letter. It contains the clear and absolute designation of the 4 quarters that made up every Mexican city, the 4 parts of the world designated by the 4 quarters of the city of Cusco, Tuhuatin, Suyu, under the Incas, the 4 great regions of the city of Babylon, and the hearth, that is to say, the temple or the sanctuary, depicted in the center. The former conception of this idea D'Extein had found it in reading the Vedas. This establishment, he continues, this institution of things, is the doing of the Hamites. It constitutes the form of the establishments that we find in their colonies, and that we can trace in a very special way in all the establishments of the Phoenicians. This is something formal, ritual, something that lies outside the very spirit in which these rites were originally conceived. The Aryans and the Semites have lodged in it, as I said, their originality and spirit. This form, this ritual, comes from an earlier world. It does not come from the instincts of the human mind or the instincts of human thought. It comes from an observation of the heavens, from a study of time, from a scientific orientation in the dimensions of space and in the succession of time itself. Let's stop here. For a moment. In these quotations that seem to come out so appropriately to comment on my work. Let's add, however, that these forms, this ritual preserved in full in the Mexican documents, came not from an observation of the heavens, but from an observation of the earth. Nothing is simpler, nothing is more grossly material than their origin. They are the phenomena that preceded the cataclysm, or that were combined with its various phases, which provide the absolute key. Each of these phenomena has become a hieroglyph, each of its phases a myth, understood under the signs of the Mayan alphabet and calendar, a geological calendar, if ever there was one, which tells, down to the smallest details, the history of the immense catastrophe from which the present earth emerged. Certainly, I am still far from having been able to read all the figures presented by the pages of M.S. Troano or the Codex of Dresden, although the translation of Tio Amoxley and the analysis of the words of the Nahuatl language have greatly helped me in this work. But I have deciphered enough to understand their overall meaning and to sketch with more or less accuracy the lines of a geographical map of the American world from 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, if not more. Up to this point, however, I must confess to you, sir, that my documents refer almost exclusively to the Atlantic side of the American continent, although certain vague indices give me reason to think that the lands submerged in the Pacific Ocean were even more extensive than those that sunk into the Atlantic. These are sometimes compared, in terms of form, to an immense animal that usually appears to be lying down and in a resting position. I will have the opportunity to return to this image. Now, the rest of the continent, if I understand the overall data resulting from reading my documents well, would have been considerably inflated between the tropics so as to cover a large part of the Pacific Ocean in the direction of India and China. Ancient traditions from Peru mention on their side the cataclysm during which the earth rose extraordinarily, at the same time abandoning to the sea the vast regions that extended to the west of the Cordilleras. On the opposite direction, the lands of the continent covered both the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. These two gulfs are designated here as the two faces of the mirror presented by Quetzalcoatl by Tezcatlipoca, and the handle of this mirror represented the extension of these same lands to the east in a measure that I estimate approximately from the paintings of the Tlatoani manuscript to be at least 800 leagues outside the Lesser Antilles. At this distance, the region bent to the north and south, leaving on each side a considerable gulf, or a sort of Mediterranean, one also to the north, between this land and the coast of the United States, whatever it was then, and the other where the mouths of the Amazon are today. This is the figure given in summary by a remarkable sign reproduced by Landa, a sign frequently found in the Codex of Dresden and the Toronto manuscript, in which I orient according to its formal, normal position. This sign, inverted, is identical with the Greek T and the Egyptian Ankh, with the difference that the handle, or rather the ring that surmounts it, a sign of the vase or the sea into which the T has sunk, is placed above, while the Mayan hieroglyph is enclosed within it. This is why, sir, the mirror plays such a major role in the mysteries of ancient cults. Its two faces are the two faces of Hermes, the cosmic lantern, the magical mirror of the world, in which he sees all beings, all parts of nature, and the structure of the earth as well as that of bodies. This is how it happens that these great gulfs are the two hemispheres of which Osiris, the great X, is the all-powerful king. This is where he was glorified, and the islands scattered on their surface were for a long time the refuge and dwelling of the instructors of all civilization, escaped from the great shipwreck. These are still the two gulfs that Brahmanic mythology made, as you will see later, the two equal parts of the divine egg from which the Brahma, the father of the worlds, hatches, whose number corresponds to the number of globules, usually surrounding the mystical mirror. In turn, these globules recall the 7 primitive gods, or, if you will, the first 7 volcanoes, which erupted in the region submerged under the waters. 7 in Egypt, 7 in Mexico, 7 that became 8, as well as the Toltec chiefs I mentioned in my first letter, and whose 8th, the Azmun of the Phoenicians, the Shmun in the Quechua language, or Mon, that is to say, the little servant, at once the youngest and most powerful, the minister of his brothers, Tlamacazqui in Mexican, known in turn under the names of Tolpitzin, Acal, and Quetzalcoatl. But let's leave Quetzalcoatl, the priest and the king, for the moment, and return to the Atlantic region, whose ruin has been the basis on which antiquity has built all religious myths. It is this region that I want to talk to you about now, and show you how it could simultaneously give rise to the two most fruitful and powerful symbols of the religions of antiquity. Section 4. The first image presented in the Mexican documents, according to the order of the Mayan characters preserved by Landa, is that of a more or less regular crescent. You will immediately recognize in it the manic sign, the fourth in the calendar I indicated to you earlier, where the lines on one side, the head of a cat or tiger on the other, denote the symbols of water and the sea. It appears here with the sign of locality, a hieroglyph for a country. Upon close examination, you'll see that it reappears with some differences. In the first sign of Landa's alphabet, A. I won't delve into explaining these characters for the moment. It's enough that you have them in front of you and can consider them at a given moment. I will only say that the nuances that present themselves in the form seem to correspond to the changes experienced by the Atlantic region, submerged following the cataclysm, and that, very probably, the first one more closely resembles the topographic configuration of the lost land. Metzli is the name under which is known in the documents in the Nahuatl language, where it is usually translated, according to Molina, as moon, month, and leg. These three words being expressed by the same word in Mexican. But if Metzli, whose meaning corresponds to something curved, to a crescent, is one of the names under which the sunken region is designated, it is also that of the companion of Nahuatl, the syphilitic, who became the sun by rising from the fire, where he had thrown himself, and from which Metzli himself later emerged transformed into the moon, according to the religions traditions of Mexico. Both are symbols of the Atlantic region at the moment of its run, and the account given by the Codex Chimalpopoca is one of the greatest episodes of the Cataclysm. Looking at the previous hieroglyph, you'll immediately notice how many myths and symbols are resolved in this single image of a curved land, such as this region was. On the right and left, inside the crescent, you'll discover a large gulf or inner sea, always compared to a vase in Mexican texts, the conon, congenital, the vase, the source of the female attributes given to the moon, considered however as a male divinity, as the body of the god and bearing or being his phallus, according to the ideas expressed earlier. Such is the origin of Luna, Lunus, whose myth I will fully develop a little later. And don't be surprised, nothing is simpler, I repeat, nothing is more material than the beginnings of ancient pagan cults whose theories later became so mystical through the philosophy of the schools. Everything for these religions started on earth and with the earth, before rising to the gods, and the worship of the sun was initially that of the volcano that destroyed half of the world. To fully understand the idea related to the curved shape of Metzli, and the role that this form, in its rough topography, played through ancient allegories, take a planisphere. Look for the course of the famous warm water current called the Gulf Stream, and see if it does not seem to follow entirely to the north. The contours of this crescent, this bent leg, buried in the waves of the Atlantic. See if, to the south, the Amazon current is not in the process of reconstructing the gulf that existed there recently. I had recently discovered in Mexican paintings the hieroglyph of this crescent. I was seeking while translating my documents to understand more precisely the effects of the cataclysm, one of the greatest episodes of which I had before my eyes. Then, while examining the geology of the island of Haiti, I stumbled upon a passage from a generally esteemed book where I read the following lines. There are people who, when looking at the map of America, have not simply thought with the French Pliny that the almost countless islands located from the mouth of the Orinoco to the Bahama Channel, islands among which one can cite some Grenadines, which are not always visible in very high tides or during great sea agitations, should be considered as the summits of vast mountains, whose base and root are covered by the liquid element. But who have gone so far as to suppose that these islands were the highest peaks of a mountain range that crowned a land whose submersion produced the Gulf of Mexico? This opinion could only be maintained by adding to the disappearance of the immense surface of the Gulf that of another surface that would have connected the continent from Yucatan to the mouth of the Orinoco to the islands of this archipelago, and still that of a third surface by means of which these islands would have been contiguous to the Florida Peninsula and some land that would have terminated them to the north. For one cannot imagine that these mountain summits themselves precisely terminated a common continent. And when one further considers that, at the 2 points by which one must conceive in this system, that the 2 ends of this mountain range touched Guyana and Mexico, there are no mountain chains to support the possibility of the split. Reason finishes off by rejecting an idea that makes a surface of several 100,000 leagues disappear without indicating the cause of such an upheaval, and without the epoch being recorded in the annals of the world. So, you see, sir, how, many years before me, the configuration of the seas in the neighboring regions of Mexico suggested to a writer, imbued with very different ideas, the shape that the submerged portion of the continent must have had before the catastrophe. Enough cosmogonic traditions preserved among the natives of the Antilles and the American continent, traditions that I have recorded elsewhere, have kept, much more than Saint Mary imagined, the memory of this great event. I will not recall them here, but modern discoveries in geology today sufficiently support the testimonies that Mexican rituals so clearly provide us. I will cite only one, whose word is not suspect. Now, concludes Mr. Charles Martins, in a recent article in the Revue des Demandes, Hydrography, Geology, and Botany agreed to teach us that the Azores, Madeira, the Canaries, are the remnants of a great continent that once united Europe to America. Now, where did the name Metzli come from that Mexican tradition gave to this continent? I will try to answer you by breaking it down. Me is a composite root itself, which belongs to the group of Mexican Guatemalan languages. E in Quechua is the tooth, the edge of the instrument. It specifically indicates the points or spikes that make the leaf of the aloe a sort of saw. It is the sign, the signal that is completed with the suffix t, a contraction of t and ta, with the affix mfl, which is the nourishing alloy, or aloe, in Quechua, and the hand. The arm in Mexican language, ma, is formed, contracted into mi, expressing the teeth of the aloe, or rather the curved shape that gives it the appearance of a sickle, and which has been the primitive type of most of the curved instruments of this kind. Hence the verb mi, to bend, to fold, to double, like a bent leg, a verb still used today to express the action of folding the already ripe ears of corn, by breaking them to dry them on the stalk. Hence, in Mexican the verb mella, to go in a curve, to snake, to express the idea of water, coming from the source, springing the fountain. According to Molina, hence metal, the alloy, or aloe, what is curved, with teeth. Finally, metzli, the leg, the crescent. In this last form, this name would come from mi, fold, curve, and dis, which alternates to sis, the hair, the grandmother, but in its primitive sense, the opening, the tear, which I will explain elsewhere, from the tu, contraction of til, whose primitive is tiel, thing that turns or moves, a root having the same meaning in Sanskrit, metzli, would therefore mean the curve of the hair or of the opening that moves, that turns, in reference to its root, and the teeth of the aloe leaf would express the serrations of the crescent, bays, and gulfs torn apart by the sea. In the Mayan language, the name of the moon or the month, for it is all one, as in Mexican is ku, pronounced u. The character representing this sound in Landa's alphabet looks like a serrated crescent, so that the same idea presented under two different symbols turns out to be both alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. It is reproduced again in the calendar under the name Min, the 10th sign, whose ordinary meaning is that of building, supporting, contracted to Imin, the one who breaks the matrix, who comes out of his mother, the sun par excellence. Here, this word obviously alludes to the volcano coming from the crescent, curved from the curved earth, which was its mother, and which you still see as a cap on the small head present here, where the eye announces the crater, the beards topped with points, the raised mountains. This name, as you can see, still offers the same root as that of Metzli, of the Nahuatl language. In the Quechua language, the same word is found to have the meaning of bending, curving, with the idea of bending to receive a burden. Hence, the secondary meaning of supporting, as the base supports the column, then of building, of being the foundation, as in the Mayan language. Hence also the analogous meanings it presents in Egyptian, whose hieroglyphs allude to the serrated leaf of the alloy, like the boat and the vase, images of the two gulfs, to the female character of the moon. This word and the name of the Greek god Min have the same origin as much as the Latin mensis, or mensis, with which mythologists have rightly sought to identify the god Lunas. You will forgive me for dwelling so long on etymologies that are not inherently very attractive, but the myth of Metzli, or the moon is too important. It occupies too large a place in all the religions of antiquity for me not to make every effort to clarify its origins. I will add, however, to conclude that if the hieroglyph of the alloy leaf, me, was the sign of the moon as a measure of time, the stalk of the same alloy, straight and rising from the bottom of the plant like a vase, men, was adopted in America from the earliest ages as the measure of space. This stalk, another image of the male joined to the female, the men, in the me, as well as the sheaf of corn, or the cane, short and lightly aspirated in Quechua, hal, in Mayan, acal, in Mexican, was at the same time the sign of existence, of being. And it still has this meaning today in a large number of words in these different languages. Hence the hal, of Semitic languages, composed of the two Quechua and Mayan words, which together in the same Quechua mean to rise by changing, that is to say, to grow, or h, aspiration, sign of breath or life, with the the water of the extent or the necklace makes the water of the extent or the necklace makes ahau, the one who is the chief who animates it, and whose hieroglyph is the same as that of Siva, or the Yoni Lingam of the Brahmanic religion, the royal title par excellence in Central America, but whose explanation I postpone for another time. This name, moreover, has the same meaning as the word mensis in Quechua, menziz, the founder, the foundation, or the measure of fertilization. In spite of a very profound science to which I am the first to pay homage, mythologists, both ancient and modern, have so far been unable to give a fully satisfactory etymology of men and mensis, especially in relation to the myth of the moon. Although their research has seriously demonstrated the dual male and female power attributed to this celestial body, it was difficult, let's say impossible, without a set of circumstances like the one that favored me, to discover its origin. It would never have occurred to anyone that it could be found in the memories of the Cataclysm. Who would have imagined that it was the result of the topographic image of a vanished continent, an image contained in the hieroglyphic books of the Mexicans? Yet this is what must now be recognized. It is indeed to this crescent, to the Metzli, moon, leg, or month of the Nahuatl language, that this idea was borrowed, the form of the male being found in the outline of the Mayan character, containing the north and to the south, in its wingspan, the female idea by its curve, and the return of its horns towards the continent. These are also the convexities expressed by the Mexican comitil, which made Apollo, worshipped in Naucratis, received the also unintelligible surname for mythologists of Comois, a name that Cruiser compares to that of the Persian Fum, and whose reason you will see later. Okay, let's get into section 5. I understand how strange it must seem to you to see myths, which everyone has hitherto believed to be of Asian origin, explained through Mexican languages and hieroglyphs. But this is a common mistake made by most philosophers and historians for the past 40 centuries. Who knows if even the Egyptian priests in Herodotus' times were still capable of shedding light on this matter? I have reason to doubt it, although he frequently speaks in his history of distant lands where I think I recognize America. It is, however, Ethiopia or Libya to which he usually refers, without precisely understanding the nature of the areas in question. As you delve deeper into the meaning of hieroglyphs with me, while unraveling the tapestry of Mexican traditions, you will see how easily these myths and symbols explain themselves. You will also notice how ingenious these hieroglyphs often are in their simplicity, and the advantage they offer for their interpretation of mythology. The first is to immediately present the material fact of origins before your eyes. They make it palpable, clarifying the varied comparisons to which their topographic forms had given rise, thus providing you with the tool intended to gradually strip them of the veils woven by priestly mysticism or philosophical speculation. You will thus end up sharing the admiration I feel every time I discover how most mythological fictions hinge on so little. I could explain to you one by one the majority of the names attributed to the divinities of ancient times, just as I have done for the Greek men. But those I have mentioned so far are sufficient for the moment. I would fear by dwelling too long on this kind of discussion to tire your attention. I will therefore move on without delay to the history of the Toltecs, whose traditions cover the more real history of the cataclysm in Mexican books. Only after exploring the main phases of this great event, as recorded there, you will be able to understand the raison d'etre of the myths that shroud the origins of the pagan religions of antiquity. These myths are, most often, as you have seen for the one about the moon, just a lightly veiled expression of primitive hieroglyphs intended to perpetuate the memory of the catastrophe. Therefore, it was useful, before undertaking Toltec history, to first present the explanation of the one concerning the continent that disappeared under the Atlantic. Allow me now to take a moment back to Mexico and briefly outline the general episodes of this great ruin, as passed down to us by traditions and paintings. These accounts, I must warn you, are quite varied, either in Nahuatl or Quiche language, or in works written in Spanish. As for the latter, they were largely compiled by the indigenous prince Tlatoani under the title of Relaciones, or Reports, and their total would make up 70 volumes. The original reports belong to the National Archives of Mexico, but they are published in full in volume 4 of the Kingsborough collection, following the Chichimeca history by the same author, translated by M. Turno Compens. I do not know to what extent the members of the Mexican nobility and priesthood were educated at the time of the conquest in the mysteries whose key I have found in these various writings. I think, however, that they knew much more about the origins of the world than they let on to the conquerors of their country, and evidence of this can be found in the works of Osiris himself. Now I'm just going to break down some of these translations, because this is where I've gotten to the point where I've translated all the way up to page like 250. So I'm just going to bring us in here and we're going to kind of just break it down. So here we go. Now, from the very first moment I became involved with Mexican history, I was struck by the material impossibilities contained within the Relaciones. What struck me even more than the strangeness of certain facts was the constant discrepancy that exists between the various chronological dates. Mr. Turno and Mr. Albin were no less amazed by this confusion, and the latter spent long hours trying to find the cause, in the hope of subsequently remedying it with the help of numerous documents he possesses. I cannot describe the efforts I have made to discover the reason for these inaccuracies. Usually, the signs expressing the years are the same in the various accounts. The number preceding them is identical. It is the years that have passed between each of the events to which they refer that confuses the reader's minds. Another cause of confusion is the extraordinary age attributed by all documents to a certain number of Toltec or Chichimec princes, an age that short-sighted critics have blamed me for, as if I had been its inventor, regarding my history of Mexico. These critics forget, or have not read what I have said several times, that my history is essentially a collection of documents intended to serve for a subsequent history. I have done what I could to explain these ages without, however, succeeding, but the notes with which my work is filled attest that I have conformed, as much as possible, to the originals I had before my eyes. It is my fault if the primitive heroes of Persia live for thousands of years. Is it? Is it not me who makes Xolotl live 300 years? Is it Tlatoani and the others? As for those who have tried to draw up more accurate chronological lists of Toltec and Chichimec kings than me, they would undoubtedly be not a little surprised if it were still necessary to multiply the years of the lives of these princes by 15 or 52, as will probably have to be done one day. Today, knowing what I rely on in their regard, the trouble has ceased. I have realized that the Toltec kings were, after all, only locations. And even before having finished my translations of the Codex Chimalpopoca, I am beginning to believe that most of the names of kings represent dynasties. Now, this is a cool breakdown that allows you to kind of see what's going on right now in what he's putting forth. So, Toltec Empire as a golden age. The Toltec Empire is described as a symbol of the golden age of a fabulous prosperity. This aligns with the mythological and historical interpretations that often depict ancient empires as utopian periods. In this case, the Toltec Empire represents an idealized time of wealth, wisdom, and societal progress. Then it's got Quetzalcoatl as a multifaceted figure. Quetzalcoatl is a pivotal figure considered to be both a prince and a pontiff, a religious leader. However, the text suggests that Quetzalcoatl is not just a historical or mythological individual, but a personification of the earth submerged in the ocean. This adds an elemental layer to his identity, making him a symbolic representation of the earth and its relations with water, particularly the ocean. Tolon, the capital as a geographical symbol. Tolon, the capital of the Toltec Empire, is not just identified as a physical location, but also symbolically represents various bodies of water, including the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. It also described as the Tapo Orb, where a region of the most fertile land in the crescent once exists. This makes Tolon a complex symbol that stands for both geographical and metaphysical ideas. Also here has Quetzalcoatl as King Pontiff of Telluric powers. Quetzalcoatl is also described as the King Pontiff of Telluric powers, which are the forces or spirits associated with the earth. Okay, so do you understand that what Telluric powers are? This makes him a mediator, not just between realms of human governance and spirituality, but also between the earth and its natural phenomena. Okay, and then lastly, the kings of Tolon are not merely rulers, but also symbols of volcanoes. Their death is equated with the extinction of these volcanoes, adding another layer of symbolism that ties the fate of the land to its leaders. Continuing on, but let me return to Tlatoani. If this writer ever reviewed the account he had written, he must have found himself quite perplexed by the numerous contradictions he encountered. If he did not correct them, it's presumably because he felt incapable of doing so and suspected that the documents he consulted were withholdings part of the truth. The educated natives of his time, who saw him only as a descendant of a trader, and the timid courtier of the oppressors of their race and country, naturally hesitated to place in him the confidence necessary to reveal the secrets of their history. Therefore, he never knew more than what, in times of their prosperity, was taught to the common people, and he was given only a crude translation of the hieroglyphs and images displayed in their paintings, which, due to its fabulous nature, could not affect the religious sentiments of the Spaniards. Ixtlioxochitl himself describes at the end of his fifth account the distrust he was the subject of from his compatriots. I have read, he says, all the histories of the conquest of this country that have been composed by Spaniards, and have found them full of the grossest errors. The least inaccurate, however, is the one written by Francisco Lopez de Gomara. These errors arise mainly from the passions that dominated the historians, from their ignorance of the language of the country, and even from the false reports that the natives amused themselves by making. This has often happened to me, even though I was born and raised among them and I am well known to all the chiefs. I will cite a few examples. One day I went to visit one of my friends named Don Lope Zaron, who lived in Coahuatepec, 2 leagues south of Mexico. Having spoken with some of the principals of that town, they assured me that Coahuatepec was once the capital of the country, that Azcapotzalco and Chalco were only villages dependent on it, and added a host of other fables like those they recount to the Spaniards. They claimed that it was only with the help of the inhabitants of Coahuatepec that Nezahualcóyotl had managed to recover his kingdom. Despite quoting old songs and showing them historical manuscripts, I could never get them to renounce their claims. A gentleman, a descendant of the royal blood of Texcoco, asked an old man native to Tepetlaztac for some information about the ancestors of Ixtlioxochitl, father of Nezahualcóyotl. The old man responded that he never had any, but that a huge eagle one day came to make its nest on a tree in the middle of the city of Texcoco. There it laid a single egg, and from this egg emerged a child. He claimed that the Acolhuas, amazed by this prodigy, had proclaimed him their king. The gentleman tried to point out the absurdity of this story, but the old man dryly replied, "This is how I answer the Spaniards who ask me questions about our ancient histories, or those who come on their behalf." This passage explains, at Mr. Tourneau, all the errors that Spanish historians have fallen into, and at the same time highlights the importance of Ixtlilxochitl's works, who knew how to properly assess the information given to him. I would undoubtedly have always had the same idea as Mr. Tourneau, sir, if I had not succeeded in discovering the hidden meaning of Toltec traditions and Mexican histories. But nothing is truer than the fables told by the elders of Cojuatepec and Tepetraztac about Nezahualcoyotl and the egg of Tezcuco. Who, among the scholars of good faith, would not instantly recognize in the latter a striking analogy with the myth of the egg from which the race of Cadru emerges? Indeed, the name Ixtlilxochitl is not only the name of a prince here, but the designation of an entire race, the brown race, like the sons of Cadru, the brown goddess who is America, the Zedruvava of Haitian traditions. Ixtlilxochitl, vanilla flower, is indeed the name that suits this deity, for the color of vanilla is precisely that of the most of the groups of this race, in America or in India. So this is a quick article I wanted to bring your attention to. It's pretty cool. It talks about how vanilla is the old black. So when you hear vanilla within this book, you're going to be thinking white, but that's not really what's going down. For the color of vanilla, it is definitely very dark, okay? And then vanilla is the old black, all right? So back in the day when they was talking about vanilla, they were mentioning black, okay? Vanilla and chocolate are equal in frequency, okay, and color descriptions, okay? So when we're really speaking about vanilla, they're blackish brown, okay? And as we can see here, as we're speaking about everything, Trili means black. Alright, so let's get our understanding and comprehension, or should I say overstanding and understanding, corrected. You dig? The egg from which this Ixtlilxochitl emerges is the famous calabash, whose two bowls formed the two Mediterranean seas that succeeded the two great gulfs on the north and south. The tree where this egg is laid, as it is represented in many paintings, is the sunken continent, and the city of Tezcuco on the shining vase is the sea that surrounded it, or that replaced it after the child emerged from its egg. This child himself, who would not recognize the Indian Eros, Krishna, the child who is initially black, then stood shining and surrounded by splendor, the volcano spewing masses of smoke, then bursting forth with fires that filled the sky and the earth. Ixtlilxochitl, not just vanilla flower as it is usually translated, but the vitality emerging from the black foundation of the eye. This name alone is enough to demonstrate to you the power and fecundity of the Nahuatl language and its original monosyllabic character, despite appearances to the contrary. However, on the other hand, the facts that I have just cited, according to the author of the Relations, definitely attest to the ignorance in which his counterparts left him regarding the real meaning of their traditions, and the general distrust of which he and his people were object in the native land. Sahagun, who arrived in Mexico shortly after the conquest, was much more perceptive. He had perfectly understood that the moving choirs of the Mexicans, as well as the songs that were repeated in them, contained mysteries that were incomprehensible except to the initiated. Even though the various schools founded for the nobility and the bourgeoisie, all the children learned to recite from memory the speeches and talks of ancient orators and rhetoricians, as well as many songs composed by their ancient poets, according to Acosta, and were taught to sing, according to Sahagun, the verses of the songs, called divine songs, written in their books in ancient characters. Only a small number were admitted to penetrate the meaning of the secrets hidden behind the words, no less than beneath the hieroglyphs. Sahagun had perfectly noticed this, and this is what he alludes to when he speaks of these songs that no one understands, and that he accuses as the source of idolatry, continuing to sprout in the heart of the conquered race, despite the efforts of the missionaries. What would have been the astonishment he had known to penetrate what he called this infernal labyrinth and understand its immense reality? Despite his profound knowledge for a religious man of his time, would he have been able to reach the heights of what the Mexicans possessed? They were therefore right to be wary even of those they considered as their friends. The state of science was not advanced enough in Europe for a Spaniard. However, learned one might consider him to be suddenly initiated into the geological history of the globe and the catastrophes it had undergone. Like Cambyses in Memphis, the conquerors would only have worked with greater zeal to destroy what remained of the monuments that had escaped the initial wave of their fanaticism, and whose existence would have appeared only as an insult to their beliefs. Let's go. We in section 6. Alright, so as the years passed, the interpretation of these monuments was naturally confined to a small number of initiates, if indeed any of them still retained the true meaning that had been attached to it. As for the historian Ixtlioxochitl, he remained ignorant of these mysteries throughout his life, although he had reason to suspect their existence. He wrote his accounts, later published by Kingsborough, to please the Spaniards. In these narratives, his efforts consistently aimed to reconcile the facts of the early history of the Americans with the dates and events of the Mosaic history. Thus, according to him, the Toltecs emerged from the land of Sonar following the flood, and he brings them after a long journey to a region of northern America where, somehow, they turn out to be only the third or fourth colonizers. On the one hand, it's the Quinames, on the other, the Chichimecs, who preceded them, and he ends up identifying them with each other. Elsewhere, it's the Olmecs and the Xicalanques, whom the Toltecs succeeded. The origins as he presents them are therefore extremely obscure and confusing. After a certain number of years, the Toltecs, having become, and Ixtlioxochitl does not say how, an integral part of the Chichimec Empire of Tlapalan, ambitious for power, revolt against the supreme leader, whom the author decorates with the title of emperor. A terrible struggle takes place, but after 13 years, the Toltecs, unable to resist the superior forces of their former allies and overlords, find themselves forced to abandon their common homeland, so as to not succumb to the weapons of the great Chichimec. At their head were the two leaders I mentioned earlier, guiding through deserts and distant regions the march of the immigrated nation. 60 leagues from the borders of Chichimec Empire, they stop at the seashore. This is the station to which they give the name Tlapalanconco, on the vase of the vermilion earth, in memory of Tlapalan, their abandoned homeland, whose name can be interpreted as the vermilion earth of the ancestors. After a few years of stay in this place, the Toltecs decide to continue their journey. I will not lead you through all the stations of their itinerary. It suffices to say that between the beginning and the end of this migration, exactly 2 of their ordinary cycles pass, making a grand cycle of 104 years, at the end of which, from the details given by the author, they find themselves more or less back to their starting point, in the region neighboring Huasteque, where they would have built the city of Tolantzinco. I won't tell you, sir, all the number and names I've written, all the calculations and research I've done to enable myself to discover on the map of Mexico the different stations of this long journey. The contradictions of Ixtlioxochitl, the countless variations in his accounts, have never allowed me to reconcile them completely, even though I thought more than once that I was about to arrive at a satisfactory conclusion. In addition to the 2 supreme leaders of the Toltec nation, I previously said that there were 5 others, lower in rank but forming with the former the council of the nation. To these 7 leaders, as I have also indicated, an 8th was added, the astrologer Human, priest, prophet, and legislator, whose wisdom guides them and leads them to the end of their trials and labors. Or on his advice, after several years of stay in Tolantzinco, the Toltecs decide to build a city that will be the seat of their government. The city is Tolon. They then gather for the election of a king to whom they will hand over supreme authority. To win the friendship of the Chichimecs, their former masters, they agree to ask for their sovereign, one of the sons of the great Chichimec who comes in to reign in Tolan. But in putting this prince in possession of the throne, they establish the strange law that no king will reign more than one cycle, or 52 years. The historian no longer speaks of the former leaders of the nation from then on. I would only point out to you that in order to have done everything attributed to them by the historian, each of these leaders would have had to live at least 200 years, from the beginning of their struggle to the establishment of the monarchy, as the time elapsed during the march was 104 years. However, age is only mentioned in the case of Human, who dies after the lifespan of nearly 3 centuries, leaving the famous Tio Amaxli as his testament to the Toltecs, along with terrifying prophecies for the future of their kings. According to Ixtlioxochitl, the dynasty of Tolan consists of a total of 8 kings and 1 queen. The last, Toplitzin, the fruit of an adulterous relationship, is a prince endowed with the most fortunate qualities. He ascends to the throne while his father is still alive, who abdicates according to the law after 52 years of reign. His ascension is followed by an era of unprecedented prosperity. But Toplitzin soon succumbs to the seductions of power and indulges in all kinds of sensual excesses. The entire empire follows him down this fatal path. The priesthood itself becomes complicit in the king's faults, forgetting the teachings of Human. The priests lead the nation into the abyss, neglecting the gods and their altars, as well as morality. They even end up committing the most enormous sacrileges. However, fortune is fickle. Terrifying omens, the appearance of comets, extraordinary phenomena in the sky and on earth, the most dire portents, realizations of the prophecies left by Human, finally open the eyes of Toplitzin and his ministers. The king comes to his senses and tries to convert his people. In the midst of the beneficial reforms to which he devotes himself, he learns that princes, enemies of his family, have come out of the countries neighboring the sea and are advancing toward Tolan with a considerable army. Unable to effectively resist them, Toplitzin works to appease them by giving up some of his riches. Among other gifts is a marvelous Tlatoani, or ball game, composed of 4 precious stones, with the ball being a carbuncle, which he sends to the coast, exploring them to turn back. However, they persist in coming all the way to Tolan. After having stripped the capital of all that made its splendor, they agree to withdraw, but not without threatening Toplitzin that they will return in 10 years to complete his ruin and that of the monarchy. Now, Toplitzin takes advantage of this respite to prepare for defense. Unfortunately for him and the nation, omens no less sinister than the first ones emerge. These are followed by calamities of all kinds: a terrible drought, unusual cold following excessive heat, causing sterility and misery. Naturally, famine accompanies this sterility, and this famine lasts for 4 years. It is only after this long interval, following the most horrific disasters, that rain begins to give hope back to the Toltecs. But they have scarcely had time to recover from all these calamities when the truce granted by the princes of the sea expires, and they see their kingdom territory once again invaded by enemy hordes. Toplitzin sends his best generals against them, but they are defeated one after another. In a final battle where his father, Tekpankaltsin, had taken the lead of the royal troops, a battalion of Amazons, commanded by the Queen Mother, Xochitl, had gathered the noblest ladies of Tolan. However, they suffer the same fate. They fall to the last woman, and Tekpankaltsin dies heroically on the battlefield. Toplitzin, defeated on another front, flees and hides in the cave of Shiko, leaving his enemies to gorge on his spoils. After a few days taking advantage of a dark night, he leaves the cave with a small number of devoted friends. He entrusts his 2 children, the hope of his lineage, to a servant and migrates to the distant lands of Tlapalan, while the remnants of the Toltecs scatter in all directions. So this is a good end to part 2, a good segue. I'm diving into this because I feel like I could go and pick it apart on my own and give you a detailed analysis, but I'm not breaking it down from the person who is really, this is that time period. This is when they're translating. This is when it's getting all figured out for real, before the veil is then put back over the masses again with the mainstream education. It was known that this was America. Like, everything is America. Everything originates and comes back to America. But I don't want to conjecture too much or give too much of my opinion. I think I've done enough of that. And I just think this is a good account. This is a good understanding. First-hand accounts of people who are getting to touch these documents in their original form. So, part 2. We're coming up on part 3 soon. I'm going to keep reading this all the way through. This book is amazing. It's giving us a lot of drop, a lot of names. We got a queen mother over here of the Amazons, okay? How do we say her name again? One more time for the Xochitl, by the queen mother Quetzalcoatl of the Amazons. Yo, if you want to learn a little bit more about the Amazons and the queen mother, I would definitely check out video that Curamayo just dropped recently about the Amazons and the woman tribe of Amazons. Yo, great video, great drop. We're going to continue to keep going and bringing forth this information and this wisdom and this knowledge. Hey, till the next one, peace and blessings. Love y'all. Hawa.